Well, thank you very much. It's a slightly daunting pleasure to be the scruffy human rights campaigner that follows the greatest criminologist in the universe, I think, was the introduction to the professor, and indeed a chief constable. But I'll have a go in any event. So much to respond to. I normally think of myself as a sort of rather grim spectre at any festive occasion, but after what I've just heard, I think I might be capable of being slightly positive and optimistic by comparison with some of the challenges that you've been presented with. In a nutshell, we don't have much time. In a nutshell, I think the good news is that the rule of law, which is what we have in common, which is why you can have a human rights activist at a Police Foundation conference. The rule of law is the connector between tradition and modernity. And I think that perhaps in that table that we were presented with earlier, you know, we saw the changes and the contrasts and the reasons for doubts and uncertainty. What we perhaps weren't reminded of in that particular lens was that there are some basic perennial aspirations that people have, and they are to some extent, not completely, but to some extent met by the rule of law. And I would say, yes, of course, the police must be creative and responsive and must evolve in changing times. But when you do that, you also do it within a framework of perennial values. And for the police, I do think in Britain that should be essentially upholding the rule of law, and policing by consent. Now, just a quick word of response on human rights, because it's been referred to by the two previous speakers. I'm sure they didn't mean this, but I want to just make clear that I do not equate the notion of post-war human rights with rugged individualism or neoliberalism. The equation of the two is a mistake if that was being posited. If you look at the Convention on Human Rights, which is now part of our Human Rights Act, which gets a terrible battering in parts of the press, you will see that this is not an individualistic instrument. Of course, it respects people as individual human beings, because that's what we are, and we're entitled to some dignity and to some respect. But each and every one of the articles in that convention is framed around the fact that we are social creatures. So many of the rights and freedoms that are being negotiated all the time, including by the police, you know, the balance between personal privacy and lawful surveillance, the balance between free expression and national security or order. So many of those articles are qualified and framed around the fact that there have to be interferences that are necessary in a democratic society. And so many of the rights themselves come from the fact that no one is an island, that we are social creatures who live in family units, in homes that we want to protect, and that we want to associate with other people, whether it's in a religious community or a trade union and so on. So these are not ruggedly individualistic rights. And finally, and this is incredibly important, this is not an anti-state instrument, because the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights before it create positive obligations on the state, especially to protect people from violations of their human rights, not violations always by police officers or MI5, but violations by their neighbours. So, for example, not long before the last general election, my colleagues and I, working with smaller NGOs and anti-trafficking and anti-slavery NGOs for the first time, were able to persuade the government that it was actually in breach of Article 3 of the Convention, the right not to be subject, sorry, Article 4, the right not to be subject to slavery, by not having a criminal offence on the statute book in modern Britain of holding someone in servitude. And we argued, and the government lawyers were eventually persuaded, that Britain would actually be in violation of its positive obligations under the Human Rights Convention by not having an adequate criminal code that protects people from modern-day slavery. And you'll notice that there were arrests, I think possibly in Bedfordshire the other week, under that new offence that wouldn't have been created but for the positive obligations on the state under the Human Rights Convention. And that is part of why I think that so many people who like the idea of old-style civil liberties, leave me alone, O overweening state, are not so comfortable with the idea of post-war modern human rights, because they are about protecting everybody, the vulnerable as well as the powerful, and they do need a certain amount of positive state action if those rights are not to be violated. So just to set the record straight there, that human rights are far from being an anti-state, let alone an anti-policing notion. Have to just respond to the tease on DNA, because I've been involved in that debate about DNA retention and in litigation in the Strasbourg court and so on. Nobody is saying that DNA isn't vital and incredibly probative evidence in criminal matters, and often for criminal matters that amount in themselves to gross violations of human rights. The debate, and I think it is a healthy debate in a society, is about whether it is proportionate to retain intimate material and information about people who have not been charged, let alone convicted, of any criminal offence. That's the debate. And in my experience as someone who's had to engage with the new Labour legislation that allowed effectively for creeping universal retention, it's actually relatively easy to get Damien Green's DNA removed from the database when he's not charged under the Official Secrets Act. But it's sometimes harder to get the DNA of a young black man in Hackney removed when he's not charged with whatever the offence of disorder is. So it's about proportionality and it's about equality before the law. And there's very few people in politics, even though there was a great big arms race to be tough on crime, there's very few people, Tony Blair nearly did it, who would actually come out and argue for a universal DNA database of every man, woman and child in the jurisdiction, even though it can be very, very useful material. So if you're not going to have every man, woman and child on a database, you then have to have a rational debate that's values-based as well as pragmatic about who should and should not be on the database, what the triggers should be. And what it can't be, in my view, and the Strasbourg court agrees with me, mercifully, what it can't be is something arbitrary that just depends on whether you've ever had your collar felt. It can't just be something that's triggered by arrest on the basis that we're all innocent, but some more than others. So now going back to what I think is the good news for the police in very, very challenging times. I think that the rule of law is something that people in this country do actually instinctively recognise. And the police's role in the rule of law, like the role of the judiciary in Britain, is something that is actually quite well respected. And when we do our own polling at Liberty on criminal justice issues, and we poll, if you like, the trust index of different parts of the Constitution and different players in our society, the police actually do very well. When we ask people, as we did in the context of elected police commissioners, that's disastrous. But that really good idea that is now law anyway, so there's no point bleating too much about it. Unlike chief constables, I am allowed to debate the way in which the police should be held to account. And I would argue that the police's legitimacy, like that of the judiciary, comes from accountability to the law, not accountability to the ballot box. That you need referees, non-partisan referees sometimes, on the street and in the country to hold the ring. So you can understand that I balk at the idea of locally elected politicians getting involved in debates about particular investigations or particular riots. Or I think there's some real danger there. The law has now passed, and we're all going to have to grapple with it. But I think we're going to have to do so with some concern and scepticism. So back to why I think the good news lies in this perennial value that people still respect of the rule of law. It links tradition to modernity. The basic idea that we ought to be equal before the law goes back a lot longer than 1962. And of course, the precise content of things like fundamental rights and freedoms that are now, to quote the late great Lord Bingham, thought of as part of the rule of law, and that's not just domestically but internationally. There has been some progress in the content. The basic principle of independent arbiters of the law and of equality before the law is something that I think links tradition with modernity. It links a culture of respect with an intellectual understanding of why we need to have such systems. And I think, to put it more simply and more naturally, I think, of course, we have all sorts of developing aspirations. We want to travel, we want trainers, we want Blackberries, whatever it is we want or think we want for ourselves and our children. But much more basically, I think we all have some kind of basic perennial human need to live in relative peace and security and to feel fairly treated. Now, all my life, people have been telling me that the instinct for revenge is far stronger than the instinct for justice. I don't agree. That's not been my experience of people's aspirations. Now, yes, yes, if a young child feels that he or she's been wronged, he might lash out at his friend. But goodness me, if you punish a child that didn't do it, or you subject a classroom of small school children to collective punishment, you will hear that is not fair. So human rights don't just kind of arrive from the planet lawyer. They are actually grounded in some fairly perennial human instincts about being protected, but also about being respected and treated fairly. Now, a lot of these instincts, before we had the European Convention, before we had the Human Rights Act, were well reflected, for the most part, in the British tradition of consent-based policing. Because police from the community will be in touch with those instincts of the community. But it's not a bad thing, I think, for anyone that they are now articulated in law. So the rule of law links tradition with modernity. That's a good time in a changing world. And it also, more good news, links the local, the national, and the global, or I might call it the universal. People in Libya and elsewhere in the Arab Spring are craving the sorts of rule of law institutions and the kind of legitimate policing, as opposed to corrupt policing in some cases, that we have here in Britain. Which means that even if you have an increasingly diverse community, or you have migrants and you have language problems and all of the rest of it, you've got a more ethnically and religiously diverse community, the basic rule of law values can be a pretty well understood language, as long as the police are both sensitive but confident about policing with an even hand. And I think they're well capable of doing that. So it's not about saying, oh, we don't go into that community when there are complaints about disappeared young girls or about forced marriage or girls disappearing from the school register. Of course not. Equality before the law. But it also means being sensitive in the context of stop and search and so on. And in my experience, a modern, increasingly educated and representative police service is well capable of getting that right. And I think that is some good news as well. And of course, the rule of law binds the rich and the poor. Right? So that's the City of London Police in UBS, in the middle of the night, whenever it was the other week. Hope nobody leaked anything to the newspapers, but that's another story. But it should protect and bind the rich and the poor. And when that's seen to be done, I actually think that confident rule of law, consent-based policing actually provides a glue in society. Now, I don't think it is a fair analysis to suggest that people rioted because they saw bankers and politicians getting away with blue murder. I don't think that's a fair analysis. But goodness me, it does help to set an example when people see that the law is being applied with an even hand. So it is right that there are, you know, that the City of London Police are in UBS, and it is right, if the evidence leads that way, that some politicians have been prosecuted for fiddling their expenses, because it undermines respect for the glue, the rule of law that holds society together, if people think that you are punished or avoid punishment depending on your economic circumstances. And I think that's incredibly important. And that won't always come out of political debate, but it does have to come out of police action, which is another very important reason for defending independence. The rule of law is something that is not always understood by politicians, who sometimes suggest that the only form of legitimate authority in a modern democracy is the ballot box. That cannot be right, as I suggested earlier. You know, a democracy without independent judges and independent police officers will eat itself, just as a market that is unregulated will eat itself. Right? If politicians are ultimately influencing who gets arrested and who gets prosecuted, or which areas of a community are well serviced with police resources, you know, what's to stop what happens in other countries in the world, even former democracies or once promising democracies, from descending into something else? Politicians lock up their opponents. There is no confidence in the judicial system, etc., etc. Democracy will eat itself. No free elections, no free press, no freedom to demonstrate, etc., etc. Today's democracy becomes something else, rather like an unregulated marketplace that doesn't have criminal law to stop people robbing each other, civil law to bind people to their bargains, and so on, will eat itself. So I'm suggesting that this basic notion of independent policing and the rule of law can be a bulwark against uncertainty and division in times of crisis. And I think that can continue. I know that we're short of time, so I'll try and conclude briefly. So what would I ask that you all think about doing, given all the challenges of new technology and migration and economic uncertainty and so on? Given your limited means, what would I suggest you do in response to what's been posited and with my view about the importance of policing and the rule of law? I'd say firstly, and I've made my comments about police and crime commissioners pretty clear, and notwithstanding that change in the architecture and the governance, I do think that operational independence has to be fiercely protected in these difficult and uncertain times. There will be no independent policing, no rule of law, without resisting some of the creeping politicisation, whether at a national or at a local level, for all sorts of reasons of legitimacy and operational efficacy. Not least, you know, if we'd had the riots after this change, would it have been so easy to, you know, to move officers around the country to support, you know, a challenge in one area when, you know, people in the locality are worried about whether riots will spring up there? So I think there's some real challenges that have to be dealt with even under this new governance settlement. I think there's more to be done. The statute is on the books now, but more must be done in protocols, in pledges that candidates in these elections must be asked to sign to ensure that operational independence is protected. I think also, and learning from the last 15 or 20 years, I think that the service should resist political co-option and the temptations of being offered more and more arbitrary power. The former Prime Minister, Mr. Blair, again, famously said, we asked the police what powers they wanted and we gave them to them. That was not Vladimir Putin, that was Tony Blair, you know, in the late 1990s. And I wonder sometimes whether all of those powers, those extended powers, the stop and search without suspicion, etc., were really demanded from the police, or whether it was, you know, it seemed like tempting politics you know, for a party that wanted to have strong law and order credentials. But if they were demanded by the police service, was that a good idea? Because when arbitrary power is necessarily abused is sometimes too strong a word, but when it runs into difficulties, it won't be the police it won't be the politicians who take the rap for it. It'll be the, you know, the police officer who thought that he was following through on the power. It's, you know, it's Walter Wolfgang getting turfed out of the party conference, or it's whatever little story will inevitably emerge of a petty abuse or irritation that can undermine trust and legitimacy, which is so treasured and so important for the police, I think. So resist those political temptations and co-options. And also, at a time when localism is so incredibly fashionable in all the main political parties, and the Police and Crime Commissioners is one possible manifestation of that, let's maintain one law of the land. Not just in relation to, you know, diverse ethnic communities, but in relation to geography as well. Now, I know there's lots that's being said about, and quite rightly, about consulting local people around the country, about what their concerns are, what their priorities are. That's perhaps all well and good to a point. But, you know, public opinion, certainly as mediated by the newspapers, can be a fickle thing. Right? And one minute it's localism, localism, localism. The next minute it's a postcode lottery. One minute you're not being responsive enough to the local people. You know, you're a vested interest group, and you're not the X factor. You're not being voted for. The next minute, why is it that people are getting arrested for this crime in this part of the country and not in another? One person's localism is someone else's postcode lottery. And of course, the duty of the independent officer of the law, whether a judge or a police constable, is to protect everyone. Unpopular minorities, travellers, as well as the farmers who are upset about the travellers. That is the legal duty in a system that has one law of the land. And at the moment, the land is the nation state, though subject obviously to increasing transnational European law in particular. And to respond to Sarah again, the other part of this maintaining one law of the land, I think it's not just about being careful about localism, but being careful about contracting out as well. I do not believe that there is a great public appetite for deputies to be sworn in by the sheriff because people are worried about crime. In fact, my feeling is that people are really quite irritated by the idea of private security or bouncers or, you know, traffic wardens for that matter, who they feel may be motivated by profit and by numbers of actions rather than independent professional police officers who they trust. If you can't contract out trust, you can't contract out legitimacy. I think there are real concerns about that relationship if Sarah's hypothesis turns out to be true, and there's a suggestion that policing services should be contracted out. And you know, if you look at other enforcement services that have been contracted out, look at aspects of immigration control. When the person on the plane dies or has been roughly treated, then who's going to carry the can for that? It's actually about making power less accountable, not about making it more legitimate, in my view. I think that as with the judiciary, it is perfectly possible for a modern, responsive, creative police service to pursue both diversity and excellence. I know these concepts are sometimes put in tension, but I don't think there's any need for that. I do think, like everybody, of course, that there should be greater ethnic diversity and gender balance and so on in a modern police service that is of the people and for the people. But I personally am nervous at suggestions that the way to achieve that is to parachute me in as Chief Constable. I might tick a couple of boxes, but I have no experience as a police officer. And I don't think that we want to go down a sort of military-type model of, you know, of officers and squaddies. This misunderstands the nature of policing, in my view. You want excellence, not just, you know, from the Chief Constable, and excellent Chief Constable Sarah Thornton is too, but we're talking about people with coercive powers on the street, and they have to be excellent at the entry level. Now, of course, some people may, you know, have accelerated promotion and have all sorts of things to offer a modern service that mean that they, you know, they shoot up the ranks quicker. But I think it would be just as odd to parachute surgeons in who've never done basic medical practice, or to parachute someone who's never read a law book into the Supreme Court, as it would be to say that, you know, someone with respect from BT or some other great corporate titan should be parachuted in at the higher echelons of the police. That's not respecting the nature of what it is to be an officer of the law from the street upwards, in my view. I, like Ian Loader, would be cautious about inflating expectations about what a police service is for. I'm so glad that Sarah said what she did about young people hanging around. I used to be young. I still hang around. It's probably, you know, my hanging around is probably slightly more offensive now than it was when I was a teenager. But there is, given the data that we've seen about more isolation, about older people living alone and single, you can understand that people have insecurities that are sometimes not well-founded. And if they are well-founded, they may not be best met or addressed by more law or more policing. And even if there is action that's required, you know, even if there's lots of graffiti and it is causing people upset and irritation in their community, there are options about how to address it. Now, it could be, let's spend lots and lots of police resources on investigating graffiti artists and arresting them and prosecuting them and inflating the penalty for criminal damage. That's one option. Another is to clean up the walls really quickly. As soon as the graffiti goes up, the graffiti is painted over. Maybe that's something for people in the big society to do when they don't have jobs and they want to help. But I do query whether it is right to turn the police service into every service. Police officers as social workers, as cleaning up graffiti. I think inflated expectations can be really, really difficult for a service that has this very, very special job in holding the ring between sometimes diverse and disparate groups of people in difficult times. Young people hanging around has led to, and the idea that it is antisocial per se for a young person to hang around because they may cause alarm or distress. That's the lower end of the definition of antisocial behaviour. You know, that kind of expectation has now led to, I'm told, a thriving market in something called the mosquito device that emits a high-pitched... You're all too old to hear it. I could just look at you. Like me, you're too old to hear it. Apparently, it's at best a dog whistle for children that only young ears can hear. And at worst, I don't know, I haven't experienced it personally, something rather more irritating, painful. A subsonic weapon, in a sense, that your young baby will hear and a teenager will hear and move on. But what kind of a signal does it send to young people in a society? You are not welcome here, and so we've invented a device that will send you away. And what if, for argument's sake, it was possible technologically to invent a similar device that only affected men? Because let's face it, you know, they make more trouble than women. So we can get rid of the men with a subsonic device that only their ears will hear. Or let's take it further still, that people of some races but others will be affected by. What kind of a signal does that send? And more generally, when it comes to stop and search powers, antisocial behaviour powers, or just the general expectation that the police should be the first port of call for social work, or truancy or whatever it happens to be, what kind of a signal would that send to a generation about the state, about law and order, about the police, about their role in this time? That's not the way to build trust in changing times. And I think I better stop there. Thanks.